Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to FortneyScott's Employer Briefing. These monthly briefings address COVID pandemic-related updates and other developments affecting our society, including the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as key judicial, legislative, and policy changes. This briefing will be recorded. Everyone who registered today will be registered for all future employer briefings. I want to address some preliminary items before we begin. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any point in time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's briefing will discuss the Biden administration's first 40 days from taking control of executive orders to new optimism on the vaccine front, to the passing of the massive COVID relief bill over the weekend. We will also address how the president's directions are reflected in the actions at the White House and in the agencies, and what these activities mean for employers. The presenters are FortneyScott attorneys David Fortney, Nita Beecher, and Bert Fishman. I will now turn the program over to David Fortney to start our briefing.
Valerie, thank you so much, and good day, everyone. We're so glad to have you with us. And both Nita and Bert, it's so nice to see you both, albeit on our screens as we continue to work virtually like I think everyone is. Well, let me just start with a few basics, and then we'll just jump right into the program because, gosh, there are so many really exciting developments that we want to talk about. First, just a word about who we are. As indicated, we are, of course, attorneys with the law firm FortneyScott. Our practice, as many of you know, involves representing clients before the agencies that we're going to be discussing today. Those are the agencies that govern and regulate the workplace, particularly the Labor Department, the EEOC, and the National Labor Relations Board. All of our attorneys have significant experience in counseling and representing clients in those matters, as well as related litigation, as well as other audit proceedings. Let me just add now on the next slide a quick word about today. Today's purpose is to provide you with the latest factual information and updates. And although many of these do involve legal developments and potential obligations, we would strongly encourage each of you to confer with either your in-house counsel or designated outside counsel to understand specifically on an attorney privilege basis how these developments do in fact impact your particular circumstances. So I just note, and Nita, I'll turn to you in just a second to kind of kick us off, but wow, it's been a month since we have talked, and although we are roughly 7 weeks into the Biden administration at this point, a lot has gone on and a lot affecting employers' interests. I think the top line takeaways: COVID slowing, happening, vaccinations increasing, very positive, confirmations beginning occurring at an accelerating rate, but not all the key confirmations for the agencies that we're focused on. But we're going to unpack all of that along with a lot of other detail for you. So Nita, why don't you kick us off?
Certainly. Let's just quickly go through our agenda. We wanted to talk a little bit about where we are with COVID and the vaccines, and we'll talk a little bit about what employers need to worry about. Then we're going to talk about Congress and the Biden administration, especially focusing, David and Bert will focus on the Senate-passed COVID relief bill. Then we're going to spend a little bit more time than we have in the last couple of weeks on the federal agencies as they're starting to roll out with Biden administration items. And then finally, we'll go to our takeaways. And so let's go to the next slide. So I just wanted to point out that we are now, we have 29 million cases of COVID reported last week. That is the lowest since this summer. There is concern that we're going to get another spike, but the thing that I think we all have to be very excited about is we had 69.9 million people so far have been vaccinated, and the new name for the vaccines, for those who haven't seen it yet, is a Fauci ouchie. And I got mine on Saturday, and I'm very excited. In fact, Saturday, there were 2.9 million people vaccinated across the country, highest so far. And I think we're seeing that roll out well. There's a lot of concern about, there are groups of people who are concerned about vaccines. For one group of those people, people that are rural, under 50, and white, Dolly Parton did a video of her getting her Fauci ouchie and sang a little tune to Jolene, which many of the Dolly fans, vaccine, vaccine, very cute. So anyway, we're seeing progress, but the one concern that people have raised is that the COVID cases are stalling. They're not continuing to go down. So we'll see where that goes from here. And I think, Bert, you're going to talk about what's going on in the states in the next slide. Bert, your
audio's not on. Thank you.
There's a slight lag, sorry. I'd like to reverse the order and start at the bottom because the one-shot vaccination, the J&J vaccine, is really a game changer. One of the most underreported problems with the vaccine regime was the record-keeping and reappointment process that had to be gone through for the two-shot vaccine. It was a burden that many states and local organizations were having a great deal of trouble also reserving vaccine for that second shot. That's gone. A one-shot regimen means you can just, invite people in, give them a shot, and be done with it. And that is in part of the promise that President Biden made about getting every adult vaccinated by the end of May. It's very, very encouraging, and it's really a terrific development. Many states and local organizations are still struggling. We hope that with the monies funded by the relief plan, and we'll talk about that in a while, will help them accelerate and modify some of their practices. COVID is slowing, but there are concern of the new variants. As Nita pointed out, the number of cases seems to be flattening. And one kind of disappointing aspect is governors kind of taking the lead with jumping the gun, really. In Texas, there's concerns that governor is changing the subject to divert attention from the disastrous cold snap impacts. But the trend seems to be very positive, with declining number of hospitalizations and increasing number of vaccinations. Also, just maybe even minutes ago, the CDC issued a new guidance for those people who have been fully vaccinated. They've been advised that they can meet in small groups with other fully vaccinated people in an indoor setting. They can even visit family members, like people in the hospital or in a nursing home. And they just still advise, as you might imagine, that you should be prudent. Wear your mask, stay social distance if you're in an outdoor setting. Try to avoid indoor settings with unvaccinated people, other than those who are part of your family units, and things of that ilk. We can go to the next slide. We can get to trying to apply this to the... Nita, please.
Hold on just a minute, Bert. Go ahead, Nita.
I was just going to mention that both the Democratic and Republican governors are very supportive of the rollout of the vaccine because they want to get people back to work. They want to get their economies restarted.
Oh, absolutely.
So unlike what we're going to talk about in a little bit in Congress, there's much bipartisanism on the vaccines. Sorry, Bert, go ahead.
Right. I would say biggest challenge.
Please, David, go ahead.
And the biggest challenge, and Bert's going to, I think, talk about this in the workplace, but we have a significant segment of our population that is reluctant and or refusing to be vaccinated. Yeah. And that's an interesting phenomenon that I don't think we fully appreciated broadly as we were developing the policy. We, I think, presumed once these vaccinations became widely available, were received by many people without any indication of any serious health conditions, at least short run, that the general population would be stampeding to take them. But of course, we know that that's not the case. Up to 33% of the military has declined the vaccination, and others. So, Bert, why don't you jump in a little bit and talk a little bit about kind of the employer and that context of that workplace, how those are playing out?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the tide does seem to have turned a bit now that the vaccines are more widely available, and it's less of a running through a maze to get one. But these data are encouraging, but not terribly satisfactory. Barely over half of employees would get the vaccine if they were encouraged by their employer. Barely a few more would do so even with an incentive. And employers are desperate to get their workforces back into place and keep them healthy. But there's a problem, and it has to do with the amount of incentive you can give an employee. In the past, in dealing with wellness programs, the EEOC has said if the incentive is too great, it becomes coercion. And coercion is not permissible because this is supposed to be voluntary. At least certainly now, and still because there's not a formal FDA approved vaccine, we're still in the what they call the EUA, the emergency usage application. So there's concern. We're waiting for the EEOC to say something about what is an appropriate incentive, how you can do it, how you can use it. Is there a limit? And then there is this last thing about whether an employer, once there is a universally used vaccine, can an employer require a vaccination for employees? Most employers have said they will not do so. Only one that we know of has insisted on it. But it's better to think about this in terms of industries. Some international airlines are already very close to requiring a vaccination certification. The success of that program will determine how far it's going to be used elsewhere in instances where there are mass audiences in indoor settings. And that means hockey games, basketball games, movie theaters, concerts, operas, you name it. So this is very, very, very much on a tipping point, waiting for some guidance from the EEOC, waiting for more guidance from the CDC, but it will all be determined by that first bullet, whether that percentage gets up to 70%, 75%, which is closer to what the CDC says is herd immunity. But those numbers will all be determined over the next years. Very encouraging news on the vaccine front. But we have to recognize, as David pointed out, vaccine resistance is real. Even among nursing home employees, the percentage is staggeringly low, below 50%. So there's a lot of education that has to happen. But I think as the vaccines become easier to get, one shot only, no record keeping, no return appointment, that these numbers will inch up and we can really bend the curve on COVID. Nita or David, why don't you take us into Congress?
I want to just spend. I just want to linger on this for a little bit more because I want to make sure that there are a couple of issues here that I want to make sure. So this Bert has highlighted for us the ADA point and the incentive. It would be very helpful if EEOC would cite some examples that affirmatively that are permitted. And employers are sort of moving into this. You know, it started with small gift cards, Amazon gift card of $25 or $50. Now it's starting to drift up to $500. At what point does it cross the line? I mean, I just want to underscore Bert's advice and point on this. It's not yet defined. This is something that the agency could list some things that are clearly compliant and say, here are some examples of things that we find to be permitted that would be helpful. Because in very real time, as employers are trying to, there's the interim question. Can we incentivize as many people to get the vaccine as possible and get our workforce as broadly vaccinated as possible? Then number two, are we going to require a jab for a job? I mean, at this point, a lot of folks are virtual. That's not going to continue indefinitely for many, many workplaces. Many workplaces in the next 2 to 4 months, you pick the timeline, they're coming back. and they're going to come back in a very robust manner. So this issue is one that I think well-counseled employers are looking at today, trying to sort through today. They need to take steps to maximize their workforce being vaccinated. Are you going to allow them to travel on planes on behalf of your company? Interface with customers, interface with coworkers. Today, and I just want to be crystal clear on this, even with the new CDC guidance, the workplace, our best read on the guidance is that although in private homes, you can take off the mask and have close gatherings, in public places, and I would consider the workplace to be closer to the public place end of the spectrum, masking, social distancing, all the rules that we now for the last 12 months have been living with and come to know and are so familiar with continue in almost all workplaces. That's at least, I think, a fair reading of the CDC guidance, and at least as of today, your general duty under Osha would suggest that. So I think that's those points in how to get more people vaccinated. EEOC, please help us update your guidance with at least some examples. That would be great.
Right.
And employers starting, don't sit back and wait, because to get people vaccinated takes weeks to months. They have to get queued up. They've got to get a vaccine. They have to wait till you're not immediately don't have immunity right afterwards. You have to wait a period of time. So this goes into that. We always have been talking about planning to get ready to reopen the workplace. The phase we're in now cries out for employer planning to understand and map these out. Nita.
The other thing that's a problem is that states are, okay, Bert, hold on one second. The other thing that's a problem is the states are moving at different rates with their vaccination.
Right.
My brother lives in Indiana. They're all the way down to 55 and up, where here in St. Louis, where, Missouri, we're still at the tier 2, whatever it is, where, 65s and up and so forth like that. So it does require a great deal of planning. Now, we'll talk a little in a few minutes about the EEOC's general counsel. It will be interesting to see now that the former general counsel of the Trump administration is gone, will we see the agency step out and provide some guidance?
They still have a 3-2 majority issue, but Bert.
One of the things that is frustrating with the EEOC in the wellness context, there was the whole issue of revealing personal health information and things of that ilk in order to join a wellness program. Those issues do not seem to be involved in this context, which is why it's very frustrating among the employer groups that the EEOC hasn't acted with more dispatch and with more vigor to give some guidance so that employers can either incentivize or understand what the programs are to help. There is a large segment of the employer population that is ready and willing to provide vaccinations to their employees once they understand the rules of the road. And we're all just waiting for that.
Another point that I think will become much broader is the concept of a vaccination passport. And then it may literally become part of our passport for international. But I think that the concept of being able to show that your vaccination and whether employers can require that, et cetera. But the key point at this stage is we don't have a uniform platform way this issue is being dealt with, but has not yet been addressed. For data integrity, ideally we want to get this so that people can show on their phone, yes, I've been vaccinated, it's up to date, and there's not a way of phoning that data. That's where we're going with that. Nita.
Right now, all that I have, and I should have pulled it out, I have a little card that says that on such and such a date, I have a piece of paper.
Right. The truth is, I got the same thing when I got my polio vaccine when I was about 5 years old. Okay, it's the same point.
I also have a piece of paper that I printed out that I can show that.
Right. But my point is, and the European Union is starting to struggle with this. There are some attempts, but it's not much of a profile in the U.S. But this is something because there's very much fear of this centralized database. But we need to find a way of having this data readily available. It's going to be critical, and doing so there's data integrity that backs it up. This is a big challenge that I think we will see being addressed shortly. All right.
David, can I mention
Any
one last thing
closing thought
before we
on this?
move on? Yeah. The
Yeah.
last thing I wanted to mention is, despite the numbers we see in the survey, and I assume it was done a couple of weeks ago, I think we are seeing less antagonism. I mean, they have the anti-vaxxers, we know that. But I
Right.
think they're starting to see more people willing to take the vaccine when they see what they are going to be able to do, see friends, go to bars, go to restaurants. And I think that, and,
Right.
you know, go back to the workplace, where I think a lot of people are looking forward to that.
Want to
So
be.
anyway, that was my
I
last
agree.
thought.
All right. Well, let's do a little bit of a pivot here and talk about what our esteemed elected representatives have been doing up on the Hill. Biden and Congress, as we call it. I mean, there's been a huge amount of activity. Here we have the mime of Senator Sanders with his mittens on, sitting from the inauguration. So a lot has occurred since he wore those mittens. But one of the most significant milestones for the Biden administration appears it will be reached this week formally, but the primary hurdle has been cleared this weekend. I would have to say, my opinion is it wasn't necessarily pretty, but as they say, they got it done. And the president's package largely came through intact. So the American Rescue Bill, $1.9 trillion. To put that into context, all the individual income tax that was collected in 2019, the year before the pandemic put us off into our current universe, did not total 1.9 trillion. This is a lot of money. This is a lot of money, even by Washington standards. It's a big amount of money. So what's in that big amount of money? It's $1,400 stimulus check. So this will supplement the $600 check that was issued in December to meet the pledge of $2,000. There was some fiddling with this, slight fiddling to keep the Democratic coalition together. You see the caps there, 75 for an individual, 75,000 or less is eligible to get the check, up to $150,000 for a couple. And there was some favorable tax treatment added for individuals that receive this. So these were all things primarily within and the bill was passed by the Senate, I should say by a straight party line vote, because of the absence of one Republican due to a family illness. It was 50-49. So the vice president did not have to cast her tie break vote. So it wasn't 51-50, but it was not bipartisan. And even though this bill polls, the most recent polls indicate that the bill is at 70%, some polls roll it up to 75%. Those numbers are absolutely unheard of. It's been decades since we have had a bill that has that level of popularity. But the president, having pledged bipartisanship, is reduced to arguing whether the bipartisan public views it as bipartisan, even though their representatives, at least in the Senate, did not, nor did they in the House for that matter. Just as a civics lesson, the Senate bill is slightly different than the House package that came over. Which means it has to go back to the House. That will occur. It's been transmitted back to the House. The House will vote tomorrow, Tuesday. That would be March 9th, and it will be on the president's desk March 9th or March 10th. So if you're sitting in the White House, that is a big check. We got it done, and that was on the top of my list. And what else is there? It's got all this other money. It's got $160 billion for vaccine and testing programs. So once again, the discussions that Bert led us through a moment ago about the vaccine rollout and how that's going, a lot more money. We anticipate much more robust rollout. So we've got more vaccines available through the Defense Production Act program. Now we're going to have much more money to underwrite the delivery, the logistics of it, and the ultimate, people administering shots. It's not going to be just through pharmacies, grocery stores, but community centers, and really finding the population where they are. So whether it's the workplace, whether it's churches in a community, places of worship, there's any community centers, we have to recognize that many people do not have the ability to register online, to travel by car to get them. So this has been some of the criticisms of the initial rollout. Pick on Los Angeles, for example. They had a wonderful large community center where you go get a vaccination. But of course, you have to have a car. And in Los Angeles, that's not that unusual. But there are a lot of people in Los Angeles that don't have a car, that depend on public transportation to go where they need to go. So those issues are going to be addressed and worked through. There continues to be the child allowance for low and middle income families, the extended paid sick leave, and the kick up on unemployment benefits. And this was really the driver. The supplemental unemployment benefits, subs as they like to call them in Washington, were scheduled to expire on or about March 14, so next week those would have expired. So this bill will ensure that there is no gap. One of the more controversial provision is whether money should go to assist states. This was a very politicized discussion, with many saying that you were underwriting states that had mismanaged themselves. This tended to break along blue versus red states. The upshot is that was successfully passed by Congress, and so that money will be going to the states. One point I want to note, this was done through the reconciliation process, and that's a mechanism using a budget point. So there are a couple things to take from that. One, it only required 50 votes. It was not subject to the filibuster. Number two, it is clear that some of the moderate to, I'll call them even conservative Democrats, have some concerns, some process concerns. Particularly, I want to highlight Senator Manchin from West Virginia. He is a Democrat. He's in a state that went overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And he has made it very clear he does not want to eliminate the filibuster, as some in the Democratic Party are advocating. He wants to see bipartisanship. He wants meaningful discussions with the Republicans before the next series of bills start going through. I think that is significant because there's a lot of people wondering, how are the next bills going to go through if they don't, unless they use this budget reconciliation point? So stay tuned. I would just add, history keeps a dear school. There was a point not too long ago, about 20 years ago, where we had the opposite, where we had a Republican member of the Senate who felt that he was pressured so much that he switched teams, if you will. Jim Jeffords of Vermont, elected as a Republican. It was an evenly split Senate. Yes, we've seen this movie before. And his answer was, you know what? If I can't get along, I'm going to change my registration. Immediately flipping control of the Senate body at that time to the Democrats. So, you know, there is some legitimate concern that if you push on a member like Senator Manchin too hard, it may be, you know what, I'm no longer aligned with the Democrats. I'll become a Republican. Now, Mitch McConnell and others would think that that's a really great development and wouldn't mind that. So the navigation of these issues is tricky. Nita.
I just wanted to mention one thing that's new in this bill is this new child allowance for low and middle income families. It is unusual. What Biden is trying to do is use these payments to help people out of poverty, to help children out of poverty, and basically to kickstart the economy from the bottom up instead of from the top down. So how that's going to play out is going to be very interesting, I think.
You have to go back to 1964 and 65 with LBJ to see the attempt through legislation to kind of re-engineer parts of our society in a fundamental way. It is very fundamental. And we will see quickly, I think, whether it's successful or not. Bert, quick comment, and then we're going to go to the next slide with Nita. Go ahead, Bert.
Well, a very quick comment. They didn't intend it, but the child care allowance passed almost coincidentally with International Women's Day, which is today. And this is a freedom for women provision. When you have child care, you can confidently go back to work, take back your role, because the recession has really cratered female employment. This is a critical and overlooked provision and really very important.
Agree 100%. Nita, let's talk about some of the other things. That's we actually are on the cusp of having a piece of legislation that's going to be signed into law, but of course we actually have other bills that are pending. So,
okay. Well, first, The next big bill is this voting rights bill. This would amend the current voting rights, replace some of the language that was taken out by the Supreme Court in its last civil rights, where they basically gutted the Civil Rights Act, and they're looking to do it again at a time when you see many states trying to make it much harder for people to vote. This cannot be passed in the Senate by reconciliation. I don't know if you all saw this today, but we were talking about Manchin, and there was an article today saying, from Senator Manchin, saying he thinks it's too easy to filibuster and we need to make it harder. So what does that mean? I don't know, but it might mean that that you're going to have to stand in the Senate if you want to filibuster, like in the old movie.
Right.
For
you
example,
have to remain standing and actually speak. You can't contract it out to let the clerk read the bill.
Correct.
Senator did.
If I could just comment, you might recall 2 sessions ago, the Republican Senate modified the filibuster rule so that they could appoint Supreme Court justices with a simple majority. So it's not all or nothing. You can modify the filibuster rule. Say, for example, if it goes to fundamental democratic processes, e.g., voting, maybe that would satisfy Senator Manchin. But it's not necessarily an all or nothing proposition. It's very sophisticated, very complicated, and we'll see what happens.
Right.
Good
anyway,
point.
So the Equality Act, which is would put into Title VII and other laws protection for LGBT. The most important thing about the Equality Act, and which will probably keep it from passing in the Senate no matter what, is the fact that it's going to override the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is the big loophole in the Supreme Court's case that added LGBT protections to Title VII, or interpreted it them. Bostock, thank you. I should have written it down because sometimes I forget the name. Anyway, there's a big loophole in that decision, which basically says that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act overrides other laws, and so that's one thing it would do. We'll have to see where that goes. But I think, gentlemen, the most important 2 things on the agenda, and perhaps we should flip-flop them, I think infrastructure is next, and then immigration for this administration. I think those are their big platforms. We have a couple of others. Yes,
I was going to say infrastructure is typically a bill that should receive bipartisan support. So putting that next and combining the points that we've talked about Senator Manchin's reaction and kind of looking for a new, meaningful coalition, infrastructure is a pretty good vehicle to do that.
Right.
So need to quickly cover those, and let's
Yes, there are just a couple of others. There's the PRO Act, which we talked about, paycheck fairness, and then a standalone minimum wage. And then I just want to go to the next slide, which is talking about where are we on confirmation. It is slower than we'd like. One of the Tandon, who was up for director of the OMB, she has been withdrawn. The person who they put up, Shalonda Young, who was put up for deputy, was very well received, and she may end up with that job. In addition to the ones who have been confirmed, it looks like Fudge, Walsh, Garland, and Haaland will all be confirmed very quickly. The only other one who seems to be in trouble is the Chera. There's some issues around his prior suing over abortion, which of course is like anathema to the Republican Party. He was reported out negatively from the Senate committee, which is not a good sign, I would think.
Right. I just would note that for in our world, Secretary Walsh, pending Marty Walsh, who still is fuzzed over in this graphic, has not yet been confirmed. We do expect him confirmed within the week. Kind of surprised that they didn't get to it, but that reflects what a mess the Senate was this weekend, tied down with the other bill. But there's no meaningful opposition to him. That's just more a function of calendar, not reflecting any concern. And when he is confirmed, I think that will result in the agencies moving out pretty quickly. Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to turn to the next slide and hand it off to David. David, you want to start us on the
Sure.
update of the various agencies?
Sure. So we'll take you through the agencies and give you the latest. And even without Secretary Walsh in place, several of the Labor Department agencies are moving out. The top of the hit parade has to be OSHA. And even though most of you perhaps don't normally think about OSHA or have a lot of concern about that agency, I would suggest to you that you, at least for COVID-related issues, you need to be mindful of it. We do expect by on or before March 15 that there will be an emergency temporary standard. That effectively will be a regulation. It will prescribe very specifically. So we're going to move from the CDC guidance that we've talked about repeatedly, and we've gone through all the iterations as they've come out, up through and including this morning's guidance, which doesn't change the workplace guidance. It still talks about masking, social distancing, plexiglass shields, hand wash stations, etc. All those points that hopefully you're almost tired of hearing about, and I hope have in practice for those that have operations open. As it is today, if you fall short on those requirements, it's a guideline. And there's an argument that you may have violated a general duty clause under the health and safety law. But what this will do is impose with great specificity what requirements you have to meet in your workplace. It will subject you to very stepped up enforcement, and it'll move from the general duty to, again, a regulatory scheme. The standards, we can predict what they're going to be, but we don't know for sure. And under this unique procedure, they will issue without any advance notice or opportunity to file comments like a normal regulation. An emergency temporary standard is very unique. It's authorized by the Osha Act. It only occurred in a limited number of times in the history of the Osha Act, where there are eminent health concerns, and I think everyone agrees that this virus would meet that definition. OSHA is acting because President Biden directed them to. He issued an executive order and said by March 15th, assess whether you're going to come forward with that. He has also made clear that he expects a much more robust performance by OSHA in terms of meaningful involvement in the workplace. I would add parenthetically, the president's view on what OSHA should be doing is almost identical to what the AFL-CIO's view is on what OSHA should be doing. They have been a strong critic of OSHA in the prior administration, up to and including unsuccessfully suing OSHA, trying to compel them to issue the regulation that President Biden has directed that they will now issue. Assuming they issue the emergency temporary standard, it's a pretty sure bet they will. They have 6 months in order to actually put out a final regulation. We will have an opportunity for notice and comment on that, and that regulation then would be finalized by December. One other thing I want to just highlight in OSHA, and I'll do this very quickly on the next slide, is the Labor Department's Inspector General. He issued a report. It's noteworthy. It has a variety of criticisms. OSHA didn't do a good job during the pandemic so far. You relied on the general duty clause. You didn't do enough inspections. All the sort of normal things you would expect the Inspector General to criticize OSHA for. But he also added, interestingly, that they should specifically establish an infectious disease emergency temporary standard. Now that's kind of outside the lane of the IG, and the reason that some of this begins to be important is when OSHA issues the emergency temporary standard, it is highly likely that there will be litigation challenges filed to the emergency temporary standard. OSHA assumes there will be. They're preparing for that. And part of the defenses they're preparing is, look, the subject matter experts, the Inspector General, the President's executive order, the data we had available, all justify engaging and issuing this ETS. So it becomes part of the defense. I think we'll see all that play out over the next 30 days in real time. And I just thought that was a very interesting and unique provision that the IG added. Almost gratuitous, but nonetheless, there it is. All right. Well, Bert, let's go to some of the other
Important.
agencies because also
Sure.
the NLRB continues to be, speaking of small agencies that a lot of people don't pay attention to, everyone
Yeah.
seems to be talking about the NLRB.
Correct.
Yeah, most people don't even know the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, designed to really regulate labor management relations, has become a kind of flashpoint in the administration. President Biden has announced his nominee, Jennifer Abruzzo, former DOL representative, former NLRB veteran, now working for the Communication Workers Union. That tells you about the affiliation between the administration and big labor. But this all is kind of in the news because the president fired General Counsel Peter Robb very early in his administration, unprecedented. People don't understand why that's so important. The general counsel of the NLRB is the most important single person on the agency. The general counsel determines, for example, what cases come to the board. General counsel determines who's an employee, the famous Uber memo that said that gig workers couldn't unionize. General counsel decides what's an unfair labor practice. So by terminating Mr. Robb, you open the door for the acting general counsel, Peter Orr, who's soon to be replaced, one thinks, with Ms. Abruzzo, to open the door for a whole raft of pro-labor actions up to and including rescission of the Uber memo, may issue guidance on further NLRA protections. But the real problem that the termination has caused is that the legitimacy of that termination is being challenged, and along with it, the authority of the acting general counsel to take legal actions is being challenged. So this is going to bollocks up the works. It may not succeed, but in the meantime, there may be an injunction against the acting general counsel's conduct. In any event, the resources of the board are going to be devoted to this. We are certain that the nomination and confirmation of Ms. Abruzzo is going to be complicated. We are certain that the nomination to fill the empty NLRB seat will be complicated. And in August, when the president has a chance to make the board a Democratic majority, that too will be complicated and difficult. And by then, we still may not have a formal decision as to whether the termination of an appointed, it's stated in the statute that the general counsel has a 4-year term. It is undecided, let's put it that way. Many famous jurists think that it's legitimate for the president to take this action, but it is undecided and no one bets on the Supreme Court. So until then, the reason this is so important for us right now is the NLRB has its own independent contractor regulation. The NLRB has its own view on whether gig workers can unionize. The NLRB has its own joint employer regulations. So these conflicts among the agencies are soon to be resolved if and when this initial issue of whether the president's action was legitimate and whether the president can have his own nominee be the general counsel of the NLRB. And it's an issue for an agency considered the most politicized of all the agencies in government, and it's now back on the front page. Everybody will be noticing over the next several months the importance of the NLRB because the general counsel certifies union elections. Everybody has read about the Amazon election in Bessemer, Alabama. That election, no matter how it comes out, is going to have to be certified by the general counsel, and regardless of that decision, that certification will be challenged. So stay tuned. You're going to see the NLRB on the front page and at News at 11 for the first time in 40 years.
Exactly.
So, all David,
well, let's swing from the board to yeah. Let's go to the EEO agencies and start, Nita, first, if you would, with OFC and then the EEOC.
So we've had a lot of questions coming into the Biden administration. First and foremost, just to reiterate Bert's comment, today is International Women's Day, and the president is going to sign an executive order. And that executive order is going to, the title involves setting up a gender council of women, basically, and it will include the heads of all the cabinets on that council to look at gender equity. So turning to OFCCP, there were a lot of questions about what exactly they would do to change from the Trump administration. And the first thing they did this week was take out of their September 2020 corporate scheduling announcement list all of the focused reviews and compliance checks that have been scheduled in there. And it appears they're going to continue to work their way through the focused reviews from the March 2019 and November 2019 audits, but the newest list, which apparently they haven't taken any off of there, those are gone, and the only ones left are corporate management reviews, FAPs, and normal audits that your normal audit. So that's sort of the answer, I think, David, to the question of were we going to continue with focused reviews. Another question we had is, were they going to rescind the religious liberty regulations, which contractors hated, which went into effect in January. They went into effect in January. They were published in the Federal Register, so they weren't frozen under OMB's memo. 2 lawsuits were filed against those regulations once they went into place. In response, the OFCCP has asked those 2 federal courts to stay the lawsuits against the regulations because they're going to be rescinded in the near future. And again, their regulations there's a process, but basically those are going to go away as well. The other thing, and I know that we've heard through the grapevine that Director Yang is concerned that contractors and the federal agencies are still confused about what is left of the executive order against divisive training. So there was a memo issued the end of last week telling all of the agencies to basically get rid of everything that was in that Trump 13950 executive order. That is now gone, and make sure that means no enforcement. OFCCP already took care of that. They took out the hotline. They got rid of all the complaints and so forth. But I think just to circle back around with this executive order, which the president will sign today, clearly, in addition to race discrimination, gender discrimination, and pay issues will continue to be number 1 on the hit parade for federal contractors. So you need to stay on top of all of that. Anything before we switch agencies?
No.
David?
How's the sibling agency, the
Well, let's go to
EEOC
EEOC. Well, we just had this whole discussion about firing general counsels. Well, Sharon Gustafson, the EEOC general counsel, appointed by Trump, was fired Friday because she wouldn't resign, similarly to what happened to Peter Robb. And it is the custom that when the opposite party takes over, that the general counsel resigns. Now, the general counsel of the EEOC is not nearly as important to the overall system that as it is at the NLRB. However, it is the person who decides what litigation is going to move forward generally. And I think that it's going to be interesting to see. It isn't clear who's going to replace her. According to what I understand, there's no one on the webpage. I checked this morning, but they will have somebody. Normally, it would be the deputy general counsel would assume the role under the Vacancies Act, but there's no one in that role right now. But I'm sure they'll put someone in pretty quickly. It will be interesting to see because remember the Democrats are still in the minority on the commission, so that does limit what they can do. But I think they will put a Democrat in this slot fairly quickly. I expect we'll see that nomination as we get those sub-agency nominations at the Department of Labor. Conciliation Rule went into effect on February 16th. It was not caught up in the froze memo either because of when it was published. That gives employers more information when they're conciliating with the agency. And I think the important thing about that is that the Democrats are not going to be able to change that. And there was a lot of opposition to this change. They're not going to be able to change it until they have the majority. They did put in abeyance, they did freeze the union official time and voluntary wellness program regulations. Those were not, the agency didn't get those out quickly enough. And finally, I'm just going to mention that keep an eye on the website, because in April you are going to have to file your EEO-1s, and that will be for 2019 and 2020 because they did not collect the data last year. There are no instructions right now on the website, but if you click on the website, there is a place right on the page that will take you where you can get the information you need. And with that, I turn the baton back over to Bert.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Nita. Wage and Hour is going to be a place where a lot of important action is going to be coming, and it's becoming soon. The courts blocked the Trump-era joint employer regulation, and just last week, a new joint employer regulation was sent to the White House, essentially, I think, supplanting it with the one that we knew from the Obama era. Very, very important. The next one is going to be about independent contractors. And in all candor, this is, to use an old phrase, this is the big enchilada. Who's an independent contractor versus who's an employee determines. If you're an employee, you can unionize, you're under minimum wage, you're under Fair Labor Standards Act, you can file suit, you can join a union. It's going to be a massive and important change from prior administrations, and certainly there are lots of debates about bringing more independent contractors into the legal system. Whether the best way to do that is to increase the number of employees is hotly debated. We've seen the problems of doing so in California. We know that the pressure is on the Biden administration to accept the view of big labor, which is to make everybody as possible employees and permit them to unionize. That was not a successful stratagem in California. So we will see what's going to happen, but we are certain that the role of the independent contractor, who's an independent contractor, how you determine it, who's an employee, is the number one issue for Wage and Hour, and we will see it coming over the next several weeks and months. It's issue number one. The other thing, yes, the paid program was canceled. That's the apprentice program. The other thing to keep your eye on,
Bert, I'm sorry,
for 15, the minimum wage.
Bert, I just want to, the paid program says the paid program is the self-audit with which the Wage Hour approves, and you can get it approved without liquidated damages. That has been scrapped. That's been scrapped. They also got rid of, the Labor Department got rid of generally their apprentice programs, but the paid program was this Wage Hour self-audit program.
Sorry. Got that confused, but didn't. I apologize. Thank you for correcting me. The other one to remember and to focus on, we only have a minute or so, I want to just be clear. The $15 Fight for 15 is not going to go away. It was the number one priority, certainly of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. You're going to see efforts either through Wage and Hour or through OFCCP and through legislation to try to address this. There's been a lot of misinformation, people forgetting that's supposed to be, a gradual increase. It's not 15 tomorrow. Like many states, we have the anomaly of senators voting against the very legislation that their own states have adopted. So keep your eye on the Fight for 15. It's going to be a central element of the Democratic congressional and regulatory agenda going forward, and it will shape a number of the issues that this administration is dealing with. And I think now we can turn to our takeaways and take a breath.
Yeah. Well, and the interesting thing is, as we go to the next slide.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is that the $15 issue, as Bert indicates, any state, the federal is a minimum floor. Every state is free to adopt, and many states do have higher minimum wages than $7.25. And in theory, each and every state could adopt a $15 minimum wage today if they wanted to. So
Yeah,
that issue of
absolutely.
what the federal minimum is there, but it does not preclude state action. And increasingly, a number of states are saying we're not waiting for the feds, we're reacting. All right.
Correct.
Well, I think one of the things that we're seeing generally and that we've discussed, that although this goes to, what's the noise and what's the signal? So I'm going to ask on the key takeaways. We're going to have a lot of noise in Congress that's going on, but what's the signal that we're seeing? And Bert, I'll turn to you first.
To continue with where I've just ended, I think the action over the next several months, although there will be lots of headlines about the battles in Congress, the action will be taking place in the agencies, and most particularly, keep your eye on wage and hour and on the National Labor Relations Board, because they'll conflict with respect to new joint employer regulation and new independent contractor regulation. It is the hottest issue. It's the one that involves franchises. It's the one that involves the reach of bringing independent contractors into the legal framework that covers most workers in the United States.
Right. So as I indicated, OSHA will be issuing an emergency temporary standard. This also will occur in the next 30 days, probably in the next 7 to 10 days. That's going to be a game changer. And OSHA, you'll learn to love it very soon if you're not already familiar. Nita.
OFCCP is, especially once Secretary Walsh is confirmed, I think we're going to see stepped up enforcement. We're always seeing a little bit of it, but I think the rollout of this new gender council and the whole focus on social justice means OFCCP is definitely ready to take off again. Bert?
Yeah, I think in dealing with Congress, this was going to be activity posing as progress. There's going to be a lot of fighting in Congress. Now that reconciliation is behind us, there's a potential for a second reconciliation because of unusual senatorial procedures. They may try to use that for other elements in the platform, but there's going to be a lot of bickering and not many successful conclusions until and unless they modify or eliminate the filibuster. I don't think that's likely in the foreseeable future. So there's going to be many bills. Well, as David pointed out, I think the infrastructure bill is the opportunity for bipartisanship with respect to a jobs bill. But we'll see in the infrastructure bill whether the conflict, the dispute between the parties trumps a bill that both parties seem to want.
Right. And I think on that infrastructure bill, I'll take the final point. The infrastructure bill will include Davis-Bacon. That's prevailing wage requirements, prevailing wage and benefit. So anyone working on doing those contracts, subcontractor at any tier, will be subject to those prevailing wage requirements. If you're not familiar with those, I would become very familiar with them. Our information is that those that enforce the prevailing wage requirements are working overtime now, getting ready to put boots on the ground to enforce those new contracts. I think we'll have an infrastructure bill by Memorial Day, if not before, and President Biden will then have a second major legislative achievement, this one probably with a little more bipartisan flavor to it. Well, let me swing the next slide and make an announcement that we're really excited about, and that is that we are going to be starting a podcast, and it's called the DC Insider Employer Update. We are going to focus initially on reporting on the first 100 days. We will be doing so on a weekly basis, so it's taking a lot of the information that many of you have come to rely on. The information is here for you, and that's going to be available starting this week. It's available on our website or through podcast.FortneyScott.com. So please come listen to it, give it a try, and subscribe to it. So with that, I want to thank Bert and Nita. Thank you very much for today's webcast. And Valerie, we'll go back to you.
Thank you all, folks.
Thank you.
We would like to thank you for joining us. As a reminder, all registrants from today have been registered for future briefings, and you may view this briefing as well as our previous employer briefings on our website at www.FortneyScott.com. Also, as mentioned, we will be providing weekly updates with FortneyScott's new podcast series, DC Insider Employer Update, that can be accessed through the website at www.FortneyScott.com. Be on the lookout for additional updates, which will be sent via email, and please follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter at FortneyScott. Later today, you will receive a survey requesting feedback for today's presentation. You are able to submit suggestions for future topics through the survey. Thank you in advance for completing the survey, and of course, if you have any questions, you may submit them via email to info@FortneyScott.com.